Aruba, a sun-kissed gem nestled in the heart of the Caribbean Sea, beckons with its sandy beaches and azure waters. This tropical paradise, located just off the coast of Venezuela, is a world unto itself, where the sun shines bright, the waters sparkle with a myriad of blues, and the rhythm of the island life is as infectious as its local music. Shimmering under the Caribbean sun, Aruba is not just another island. It's a canvas painted with the vibrant hues of its diverse landscapes, from the blushing pink flamingos that dot its salt pans to the rugged cacti that punctuate its desert-like interior. The island's climate is as welcoming as its people, with a near-constant temperature of 82 degrees Fahrenheit, cooled by the refreshing trade winds. Known affectionately as One Happy Island, Aruba is more than just a catchy nickname. It's a testament to the spirit of the Aruban people, who greet each day with a smile and embrace life with a warmth that rivals the Caribbean sun. The island's unique blend of cultures, from its indigenous Arawak heritage to its Dutch influences, has shaped its rich history and vibrant lifestyle. Aruba's charm lies not just in its natural beauty, but also in its rich tapestry of experiences. From the thrill of windsurfing on its windswept coasts, to the tranquility of a sunset stroll along its pristine beaches, from the culinary delights of its local cuisine to the allure of its luxury resorts, Aruba offers something for every kind of adventurer. Whether you are seeking a romantic getaway, a family vacation, or an adrenaline-fueled adventure, Aruba has you covered. And with its commitment to sustainable tourism, you'll not only have a memorable trip, but also contribute to preserving this beautiful island for future generations. Aruba, with its sun-drenched beaches, vibrant culture, and warm-hearted people, is more than a destination. It's a feeling, a state of mind, a slice of paradise that leaves you longing for more. So, are you ready to explore the enchanting Aruba? Dive right in. Imagine a day basking under the Caribbean sun on Eagle Beach, one of Aruba's most pristine beaches. Picture yourself on a stretch of powdery white sand, the crystal-clear turquoise waters gently lapping at your feet. This is Eagle Beach, a haven for sun worshippers and water sports enthusiasts alike. You might find yourself captivated by the sight of the fofoti trees, their silhouettes etched against the vibrant sky. Or perhaps you'll be drawn to the rhythm of the waves, perfect for a lazy afternoon of boogie boarding. And as the sun dips below the horizon, you'll witness a spectacle of colors, a sunset like no other. It's the ideal time to unwind with a beach picnic or a casual beach volleyball game. This is Eagle Beach, more than just a beach, it's an experience. A place where every grain of sand tells a story, every ripple in the water invites you to dive in. Eagle Beach, a slice of paradise waiting for your footprints. Aruba's culinary scene is a delightful fusion of flavors, a testament to its rich cultural heritage. This island serves up a smorgasbord of mouth-watering dishes, each with its unique story and blend of flavors. First on the menu we have keshi yena. This traditional Aruban dish is a true delight for foodies, a beautiful combination of Dutch and Caribbean flavors. Imagine a hollowed-out ball of Gouda or Edam cheese filled to the brim with spiced chicken, vegetables, and olives, then baked to perfection. The result? A gooey, savory treat that's a riot of flavors in your mouth. Next up, pastechi. Often referred to as Aruba's version of the empanada, pastechi is a popular snack or breakfast item. These half-moon pastries are stuffed with a variety of fillings, from cheese and ham to ground beef, chicken, and even seafood. The pastry is then deep-fried, resulting in a crispy outside and a warm, flavorful filling. While you're in Aruba, don't miss the opportunity to dine at some of the island's popular spots. Zerover's, for instance, is a local favorite for fresh seafood. And for a unique dining experience, head over to the old Kunuku House, where you can enjoy traditional Aruban dishes in a charming, restored farmhouse. Aruba's cuisine, a gastronomic journey that tantalizes the taste buds. So come, join the feast, and let Aruba's flavors lead the way to an unforgettable culinary adventure. In Aruba, luxury finds a new definition in the island's world-class resorts. These stunning havens, nestled amidst the island's natural beauty, offer an unparalleled experience for every traveler. Imagine waking up to the sound of the ocean's waves gently caressing the shore, the sun's first rays painting a masterpiece on the canvas of the sky. This is what mornings look like at the Bukiti and Amp Tara Beach Resort. A boutique-style paradise, this resort is a haven for couples seeking a serene, romantic getaway. Or perhaps you're seeking an all-encompassing experience. The Ritz-Carlton Aruba delivers just that. With its remarkable ocean view suites, a world-class spa, and an array of dining options, this resort ensures that every moment of your stay is imbued with luxury. And then, there's the Renaissance Aruba Resort and Amp Casino. Located in the heart of Orangestad, it offers the unique opportunity to enjoy both the city's vibrant culture and an exclusive private island. A resort that truly captures the spirit of Aruba. Each resort in Aruba tells a unique story. They're more than just a place to rest your head after a day of exploration. They're an integral part of the Aruban experience, offering a blend of comfort, opulence, and the warm Aruban hospitality. They're your home away from home. Luxury paired with comfort, creating an unforgettable stay in Aruba. Aruba's history is as captivating as its beaches, a tale of centuries waiting to be discovered. This enchanting island, though known for its sun-kissed beaches and azure waters, holds a rich tapestry of history that whispers tales of the past. Our journey through time begins at Fort Zoutman, Aruba's oldest building. Constructed in the late 18th century, this fortification stands as a testament to Aruba's Dutch colonial past. Walk through the corridors of time and experience the echoes of a bygone era. The fort is also home to the King Willem III Tower, a beacon of history that has stood watch over the island for over 150 years. From the sturdy ramparts of Fort Zoutman, we move to a different facet of Aruba's history, the Aruba Aloe Factory. Aloe, known as the desert lily, has been a part of Aruba's history for over a century and a half. The Aruba Aloe Factory not only showcases the production of aloe-based products, but also narrates the legacy of this miraculous plant on the island. As we delve deeper, the Dutch influence on the island is hard to miss. From the architecture to the language, the Dutch have left an indelible mark on Aruba. The Dutch influence is most visible in the island's capital, Orangestad. Named after the Dutch royal house of Orange, the city is a delightful mix of traditional Dutch architecture and vibrant Caribbean colors. But it's not just bricks and mortar that bear witness to Aruba's history. The island's vibrant festivals like the Grand Carnival, traditional dishes like keshi yena, and the warm, welcoming locals all carry the essence of the past, making history a living, breathing part of Aruba. So whether you're a history buff or just a curious traveler, Aruba's historical sites offer a fascinating glimpse into the island's past. The echoes of history reverberate through the island, intertwining with the rhythm of the waves, the rustle of the palm trees, and the laughter of the locals. In Aruba, every historical site has a story to tell. Aruba enchants with its natural beauty, a treasure we must strive to protect. This Caribbean gem is not just a paradise for us visitors, but also a home to a rich biodiversity that thrives in its unique ecosystem. In order to keep the island's charm intact, it's crucial for us to respect Aruba's environment. Environmental conservation isn't just a buzzword, it's a commitment. It's about understanding the delicate balance of nature and doing our bit to maintain it. In Aruba, this means appreciating the island's natural wonders without causing harm. This begins with the smallest of actions, not littering the beaches, using refillable water bottles, or even choosing tours that practice responsible tourism. Let's talk about the flora and fauna. Aruba is home to a variety of species, some of which are endemic to the island. Disturbing the wildlife or their habitats is not just disrespectful, it could also disrupt the island's ecological balance. Remember, it's a privilege to witness these creatures in their natural habitat, so let's observe from a distance and leave no trace. Aruba's coral reefs are a sight to behold. However, they're also very sensitive. When snorkeling or diving, make sure not to touch or step on the corals. They are living organisms that take centuries to grow, and even the slightest touch can cause damage. And let's not forget about water conservation. Aruba is a desert island, and fresh water is a precious resource. Simple steps like turning off the tap while brushing your teeth or taking shorter showers can go a long way in preserving this vital resource. Lastly, consider supporting local businesses that are committed to sustainability. From eco-friendly accommodations to restaurants that source locally grown produce, by choosing these, you're not just experiencing authentic Aruba. You're also contributing to the island's sustainable future. Remember, the objective is to experience Aruba in all its glory without leaving a negative impact. It's about creating memorable experiences while preserving the island's natural beauty for future generations. In Aruba, let's tread lightly and leave only footprints. Aruba, a Caribbean paradise, awaits your arrival with open arms. This vibrant island, a gem tucked away in the azure sea, offers a treasure trove of experiences that will etch themselves into your heart, leaving you with memories to last a lifetime. Can you imagine starting your day with a sunrise walk along Eagle Beach, where the soft white sand meets the turquoise waters, creating a scene so picturesque it seems plucked from a postcard? There, you'll soak up the sun and let the island's tranquility wash over you as you revel in the beauty of one of the world's finest beaches. As the day grows warmer, you'll find yourself delving into the rich flavors of Aruba. From the freshest seafood to the delectable pasteki, your taste buds will embark on a culinary journey as diverse and vibrant as the island itself. And what better way to savor these flavors than by dining in the open air, with a panoramic view of the Caribbean Sea before you? And let's not forget about your home away from home. Whether you choose a luxurious resort or a cozy guest house, you'll experience the warm hospitality that Aruba is known for. Here, relaxation isn't just a possibility, it's a promise. But Aruba is more than just a beach destination. It's an island steeped in history, with captivating sights that tell tales of the past. From the ancient Arawak drawings in the caves of Aracoc National Park, to the iconic California Lighthouse, a testament to the island's maritime past, you'll find yourself drawn into the stories that make Aruba what it is today. And as you explore, remember to respect Aruba's environment. This island paradise thrives on its natural beauty, and preserving it is a responsibility we all share. Aruba, where every day is a new adventure. Come, explore, and create your own Aruban story.